Frank Alexander is Director of the Boulder County Department of Housing and Human Services. He's worked in Boulder County for over 20 years, and he recently received a national award from his peers for his outstanding local leadership. Frank has worked in this field from his heart for many years, and we're very fortunate to be speaking with Frank today. So just a bit of context in terms of data, Frank. From our trends report and through over 50 community listening sessions throughout the county, the number one issue we hear about in Boulder County over and over again is affordable housing. According to trends, more than 60% of Boulder County residents don't earn enough to buy a house, and more than half of the people who rent in Boulder County need to spend more than a third of their income on rent. I know that affordable housing touches everything. Frank, from your perspective, what's the essential challenge about affordable housing in Boulder County?
Well, thanks, Jeff, first of all, for having this conversation. I think it's really critical that the Community Foundation and everyone you touch continues to raise their voice and is engaged in the work around affordable housing. I think from my perspective, you know, our department touches more than 90,000 people every year, and literally every day we are filled with stories of people who are struggling to figure out how to keep their housing stable. And it's a sort of daily occurrence for them. And I think underlying all of that, which there's sort of story after story after story of, regardless of your station in life or your age or your income, the nature of that instability and what it creates in your own family life. But I think underneath all of that is really like, well, who are we then as a community? And what is it that we want to be? And how are we really reflecting our values in the way that we prioritize where we put our efforts? And how do we see the essential core, really most critical part of our well-being being where we live and how we feel we're part of the community that we live and we work in and our kids go to school in. And without that underpinning being more stable, we really haven't, I think, taken ownership for what kind of community it is that we want to be and what we really want to stand for. And I think it's a critical question for us that have been lucky enough to live here and work here for a while to grapple with, because it's going to be the number one issue that we face over the next couple decades.
Frank, we've known each other for some years now, and I know a little bit about your personal history here in Boulder County. But if you could share just from a very personal perspective how this issue has touched your life and how you've been involved in it.
Yeah, so, you know, I've been doing human service work in Boulder County in the government for more than 20 years, in Boulder County government for 21 years. And before that, I spent pretty much the previous 8 or 9 years in the nonprofit sector and doing homelessness work for both individuals and families in Philadelphia and New York prior to moving here to Colorado in the 90s. And I think throughout all of my experiences, which have been really deeply personal, the number of people and families that I've touched and experienced and learned from, the number one vulnerability that I have seen sort of consistently throughout all of my years of work has been the critical nature of home and the importance of home in each person's life. And I think that goes those stories have just magnified over time. You know, in my time in Boulder County, we've also been through several major disasters, and those disasters have tended to bring the community together, and they've also, I think, really surfaced what it means for people to really experience a deep level of vulnerability, and when it shows up in such a more, I think, obviously prevalent way in the community, where homes are flooded and homes are destroyed through the fires that we've experienced. And so I think for me personally, I have watched folks who are older and need to transition to more supportive housing later in life have to be dislocated out of the community. I've watched kids move away. I've watched families whose homes were flooded or burnt who've had to leave the community. I've watched individuals who were really top community leaders that would have had a multi-decade impact on our community have to pick up and move. And the sad part of all of those stories is that because we haven't really thought that through, we've kind of created a sense without a priority around housing that if it's not easy for you, you're not wanted here. And what we don't know when we don't have the conversations that we need to have is what we lose as a result of that. So you almost can't reconcile what you've lost if you never had it. And I think housing is such a critical piece of our fabric, and the stories that underpin people's vulnerability are profound. And they really need to be heard because our humanity is tied up in the stories, right? All of us have now known or experienced someone that we love who is struggling with a housing issue, and yet we're still afraid to tell those stories. We're still afraid to share that vulnerability, and we're still afraid to talk through the critical policy and fiscal and structural issues that have to be addressed for us to change that dynamic.
Frank, you are one of those people who has been able to stay in Boulder County as a public servant and make a profound change to the lives of people here in Boulder County for the past couple of decades. Would you be comfortable sharing your own story of home and family and how you came to stay here?
Yeah. So for me, when I moved here, which was in my late 20s, it was an entry-level job within Boulder County. I'd come out of the nonprofit sector, and the housing market was really significantly difficult at that time as well. And I was fortunate enough after renting in the community for a while to be able to buy a permanently affordable townhome in a community land trust, which is one of the many successful efforts that our community has tried to ignite and support over time. And what a community land trust allows for is a lower level purchase point for people to buy into a community, and it's one of the most important, I think, strategies that we have for people to enter into our community and be able to reside here. So that ability for me to actually be able to buy a townhome and move in there with my 2 young children is without question one of the only reasons why I'm still here. If I hadn't had that chance, I don't think there's little doubt that by now I would have probably transported myself to another community where I would have had the opportunity to live.
So your ability to stay here is one of those stories of it's the good part of the story. We don't need to consider what we would have lost without you, but we can see what we gained by your ability to stay.
Yeah, I think there's so many people who have benefited by having access to just an affordable home in the time that they need it, and have then gone on to, in numerous examples, then gone on to become part of the fabric of the community. The folks that teach in our schools and that help our young kids in child care facilities, and that serve our elders and seniors in long-term care facilities, and that protect our forests and our homes from fires, and our law enforcement officials. And there's just countless examples of that. And as we grapple with the future around housing, we have to think about our overall values. Housing is as essential a component to a community as your roads and your hospitals and your schools. And if you don't see it as part of a community's infrastructure, and that you have to meet a diverse range of incomes and a diverse range of physical needs and a diverse range of family sizes with your housing stock, your community will become increasingly homogeneous, increasingly less resilient, and increasingly less dynamic.
Are there stories through the years that you've encountered, people that you've encountered who have been struggling with this issue of housing that you just can't forget? They just kind of stay in your heart.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think for the whole community, and people that I think whether you work in the schools or the healthcare system or the community-based agency systems or the work that we do, I think every day you're working with families and individuals that are that have a major story to tell around their feeling of vulnerability in our community and housing as a root cause of that. And so for me, it's literally been hundreds and hundreds of intense and critical stories. And I'd say stories both of tragedy, but also of success. I think our community has struggled mightily to address some of these problems, and I think this moment in time we have an opportunity to actually do something much more significant together to help solve some of these problems further upstream. But I think most of our responses up to now have had to be more on the individual level. And I can give any number of examples. A couple highlights I'd say are we actually had a couple young boys here in Boulder County who were extremely vulnerable and ended up living in foster care and were having a very difficult time in foster care. And because of our community's generosity and access to affordable housing, their grandparents were able to move here and live in our community, and those boys were reunited with their grandparents, and their lives went on to be a much more successful and much happier as a result. We've also had any number of folks who used to be housed, who, because of simply one health crisis or one loss of paycheck, have ended up living in their cars, and that includes families with really young children who, would just be living in a parking lot in Longmont or living in a parking lot in North Boulder, who a couple weeks ago were housed, and we see those kinds of stories happen in very cold times, physically cold times in the winter. And I'd say that the universal underlying struggle that we see with people, so we know that 54% of all renters are housing cost burdened, and that more than 50,000 people right now are living in a home where they're spending more than half of their income on housing, which means for most of those individuals and families, they are just one problem away from their home becoming temporary and them needing to be dispersed. So I'd say that I could kind of go on. I don't know how many stories you'd like me to tell, but there's a lot of them I could share past that.
Thank you. Well, I'll just share one of mine, and maybe it'll trigger another one of yours. At one of these 50-some-odd listening sessions, this was at a community rec center, we were wrapping up. We had finished, and a woman came in, a senior citizen. She said, "Is this a listening session? And am I too late?" And we said, "No. Have a seat." And so we sat down and did a one-person listening session. And it turned out that she had come into the rec center to use the shower, that she and her husband were living out of their car, that she'd been a teacher, and the rent just went up, and finally they couldn't afford it. And so she had come into the rec center to try and find a home for her cat and to take a shower. And I asked her if she had any food, and she said she was going to try and get some from the local church food pantry. And so I said, "Look, I don't mean to insult you, but this is all the money I have. And if it can help, please use it for food. He said, well, we've got an ice chest in the back of the car, and I think this will help for now. And so that was a person in one listening session very acutely talking about not having a place to lay her head. And I went home to have dinner with my family, and I'm sort of sitting there pushing the food around on my plate. My daughter says, "You okay, Dad?" I said, "I don't think so. I don't think I'm okay. I don't think we're okay." And stories like that you just can't forget.
Yeah, I think, every day we have hundreds of families and literally thousands of kids that have experienced homelessness in the community, and they have stories that you can find. They are not hard to encounter and to understand that we have to do better. That there's more that we can do. This morning I was visiting with a community member, and she's a woman who happens to have cerebral palsy and a disability, but for access to affordable housing, she would have to move into an institution, a long-term care institution. And because she's been able to receive support in the community, she can live not only a life that she wants to and have her own place to be, but she doesn't have to move into an institution that she really doesn't need the services of. That would just be a home that she would need to be in, because there's not a place for her to live in the community, and the community suffers because of that, right? It's not only what she doesn't want, but it ends up being much more costly, and the quality of life for folks in our community that have to resort to decisions that are not the best for them makes us all suffer.
Well, Frank, let's talk about what one person can do to make a difference in affordable housing, and then what we can do together and what the foundation can do.
Well, I'd say in terms of what one person can do, I think the problem that we've had for so many years on issues of difficulty is that it feels hard to tell our stories and to share what we've experienced or what we are exposed to, and then to know where to tell those stories. And I think it's really important in this window that we have right now, because there are more people concerned about housing in our community than there have ever been in the more than 20 years that I've been here, which gives us a chance to have a different kind of conversation, and to have that conversation be inclusive of every voice, and not in a way where building an affordable housing home is seen as a negative thing that has to be battled, but as a core component of the kind of quality of life that we want to build throughout the community. And so people coming and telling their stories about their own issues with finding affordable housing, the type of community that they want to be part of, the ways that they contribute to our community, and what it means for them to not have a safe and stable place to live, I think are really critical. So we've started this campaign called the Home Wanted campaign. It's at homewanted.org, and we have hundreds of community members that are starting to come and tell their stories about their jobs and what they do in the community and what they want to see and how important a sense of home for them is. And that voice is really critical. And it's very important that the public tells public officials, elected officials, people that work in agencies, that housing is a big issue, and we need to do something together, because housing is not an issue that you're going to solve one home at a time. We need to have a plan and a priority together around housing, and it's really critical that decision makers hear from families and individuals who are struggling with housing, because they often don't. I think one of the things that we hear from elected officials and others most often is that despite what they know about the data, that they don't hear from a lot of people directly. And that without that community voice coming to them, it makes it harder for them to be able to make the decisions that they need to make, for them to hear the stories that they need to hear, and for solutions to really surface collectively in the process.
So when we're thinking about elected officials who would appreciate these stories in addition to the data, what are some examples of types of elected officials that the individual can connect with?
Yeah, so I'd say everyone resides in, whether in a home or doubled up or wherever you may be, resides in a community that has an elected board, a town board or a city council, and your local official is like the boots on the ground person closest to the solutions and closest to the issues. So I'd say each person talking to their town board or their city council or the Boulder County Commissioners directly and letting them know your story and also the importance of a safe and stable home in your life is a very critical part of the work ahead.
And then collectively as a community, what can we be doing together to advance this issue?
Well, so I think one of the great things that we've done over the last 3 years has been to build, we actually have a regional housing plan, and the plan has been adopted by every jurisdiction in the county to date, and it designates that we will achieve a 12% affordability goal by 2035, which means that of all the homes that are then built and exist in Boulder County by 2035, which is roughly 15 plus years from now, that 12% of them, or a total of 18,000 homes, will be affordable to our community. And that plan has a number of strategies, and they include preserving affordable housing that exists. They include land banking. They include, changing the policy framework, the zoning frameworks, the incentive frameworks around developing affordable housing, and they include really resourcing it. And all of those solutions are currently being worked on by many folks countywide in cities and towns and in the county together. And I think they need a different level of community involvement and community awareness. We have to have more hands on deck working on the policies and the funding necessary to achieve a much deeper level of affordable housing than we currently have in our community. I think letting your elected officials know that that's critical, including the need for the right kinds of resources and funding in place to make that happen, is critical.
What would you hope that Boulder County's Community Foundation would do? What role would they play in this effort?
Well, I think, Jeff, your leadership with the Community Foundation has already been essential. I think the listening sessions that you are helping lead countywide around raising resident voice and surfacing issues around disparity and inequity in our county is incredibly important. And I know, because you've told me many times, that housing is the #1 issue that surfaces in that way. I'd say the community itself needs partners and leaders like the Community Foundation to have a strong voice and a strong presence in these conversations, so that we can achieve the kinds of solutions that are necessary to really make a dent in this problem. And I think engaging the community and raising the voice of residents and elevating the issue and bringing people together to come up with creative solutions. I think the excitement that I've personally seen around the regional work has been really profound. We've already seen public-private partnerships grow. We've already seen land that was previously not known about be allocated for affordable housing. We've already seen, people come tell their stories, all in the context of what I would say would be an unlikely event just 3 or 4 years ago. And I think the Community Foundation and all the folks you work with can help create that environment where these are the stories that need to be told, and this is the issue that we need to talk about, and there are things that we can actually do. This is not We are not victims of circumstance. We actually built the community that we live in. We are responsible for it. We've created the conditions that are here now, and it is up to us to create the conditions that we want for the future. And if the conditions that we want for the future are not present now, we have to act, and we have to act collectively, and we have to work with each other to achieve those goals. And I don't think there's any higher calling than that in life anyway. And I think the Community Foundation can make that happen.
Earlier in a previous conversation, Frank, you were saying that this is a uniquely critical time of possibility to really make a difference on this. Can you say more about why that is?
What we've seen over the last 3 years in engaging the community around building this plan, and we specifically laid out in the plan sort of a 17 to 18 year time frame. And the first 2 to 3 years were really more community conversation, more will building, more storytelling, more engagement, and then really start to get to work and start to put the solutions in place between 2020 and 2035. And I think we as a community have broadly demonstrated our commitment to, values that matter to us. We early childhood education, quality of life, preventing, sort of the most negative effects of climate change, and preserving our environment, and building an inclusive community where we are working harder to make access to opportunity more equitable for all. And housing is a non-negotiable part of that. And I think that really, based on what I've seen over the last 20 plus years here, and what I think is very easy to predict between 2020 and 2040, I think there are known factors that we cannot pretend don't exist, that now in this window of time, in the next 12 to 24 months, it's essential that we make a bold statement about moving forward on a regional strategy to improve access to affordable and a diverse housing stock countywide, because the window will close. This window does not stay open forever. We have a number of opportunities before us, but if we don't work together right now, it is going to become increasingly difficult.
Why will the window close?
Well, we've seen cost inflation in the county. We've seen any number of thousands of residents migrate out of the area. I'd say we're at risk of further dislocation. We're at risk of further inequity, and we're at risk of really, in a long-standing way, sort of locking in that there will be no access to affordable housing in the county if we don't take steps right now when there's still more opportunity.
Is there anything that we haven't covered or I haven't asked you that you'd want to be sure to say?
I think that in the time of life that we're in, and the time of sort of the struggles that we face around dealing with really root cause issues as a community, it provides a window where every one of us can really grow in ways that we didn't anticipate. And I think that when we, instead of turning away from each other and turning away from problems, we actually turn toward each other and face the problems together with our eyes open and our hearts really open, where we're not afraid of the stories that we're going to hear, and we're not afraid about the history that underpins those stories. We're not afraid to think about poverty, and we're not afraid to think about inequity, and we're not afraid to think about climate change and affordable housing and educational disparities. When we're willing to actually talk about those, and then we actually decide to work on them together, each of us actually is immeasurably improved. It is we benefit from doing that together. because we are locking arms and we are committed to having the kinds of conversations that need to be had and to doing the things that we must do, because they're not impossible. What creates the sense of impossibility is the hopelessness that we engender in one another when we don't work together and when we don't face root problems. And so I think my experience of being part of this community for this long is just the unbelievable honor that I've had to work with folks like you, folks that have been involved in the Community Foundation, folks that have been committed to, really rolling up their sleeves and really trying to make a difference. And I think invariably, when we're doing that together, none of us would trade that for anything. We really, our own lives are so improved. Whether we win every battle or whether we conquer, every mountain that we have to climb, in a sense, it's not irrelevant, but regardless of whether that happens, we know we're better for it, and then we have much more, courage and conviction to kind of keep going and do more of what's necessary. And I think that's what the community is asking for, and I think where everyone involved in the Community Foundation can help us lead is to really engender that sense of hard work and hope and conviction that, we're not going to solve every problem. It's not going to be perfect, but we can solve a lot, and we will be better for it in addition to the work that we'll do for others.
Thank you, Frank.